I could say I've been researching drugs for over 40 years, close to 45, actually, 10 on the street and 30 now in research labs. I decided that it seemed obvious that something must be wrong with my brain. I had an interest in biology, so I became a neuroscientist. And now I work with students at Bucknell and other places, and I study I'm interested in what's different about the brains of people like me, really before we ever develop a problem. So I want to know about that neural liability, and that's what the purpose of that book is. And like kids today, my kind of gateway was probably marijuana. Even though I liked alcohol and I drank it pretty much every day, I chain smoked marijuana. And this was in the 80s, so you could do that. It wasn't nearly as strong as it is today. But it is the case that most kids, about 40% of 40 to 50% of kids are picking up THC. And as a result of legalization in lots of places, they're using more and more of it. So this is a map. You can see there's only a few states where it's not legal. And in many places, it's masquerading as medicine. And I say masquerading because I'll describe that later. But like other addictions, about 20% of people who use marijuana on a regular basis develop, they call it cannabis use disorder. And what predicts what those factors are? Early onset. So using as an adolescent, which is of course when most people do. There are a few genetic factors, liking the drug. So it's always the case that some people, even with opiates, they try them and they don't like them. So they're protected. And that's true with marijuana. I was one that loved it. Using to cope. So that's one of the steps on the way to a full-blown substance use disorder. Having stress, which we all have, and other psychiatric disorders. But I want to illustrate the Solomon and Corbett's model in terms of marijuana. And to start with that, I need to start with really what is marijuana exactly. So the plant produces over 100 chemicals, and a few of them can change the way we feel. There was just a new one discovered, but most of the recreational effects are due to delta-9 THC. This compound is entirely, therefore, responsible for getting you high. It has no medical benefits. And I'm really up on the literature. And I just gave a talk a few months ago with somebody from Harvard, and he said the same thing. So no medical benefits. It has significant risks. One of them is psychosis. Psychosis is a main symptom of schizophrenia. And it looks to, in a few good studies now, that about 40% of the new cases of schizophrenia are attributable to smoking high potency weed. So we're going to see an increase in schizophrenia that's due to ubiquitous use of marijuana. It also reduces your ability to think and reason, for sure. Both of those are sure. And it's also associated with depression. So I say associated because we know it can precipitate psychosis. We know that it causes reduced cognitive function. And I can give you papers for those things if you want. There's a couple of them up here. But it's associated with depression. That means that the more you smoke, the more likely you are to be depressed. And in a recent study, the last one up there, they found that they started with kids who hadn't been smoking, measure their depressed state, and then watched how that changed with regular use. So the more you smoke, the more depressed you are. And all that is to say that it doesn't look like a good medicine. Pretty much the same with anxiety, by the way, although those data are still coming. Now, CBD is another compound in the marijuana plant. It is medicinal. Oh, I'm sorry. It is medicinal. It's very helpful for some kids who have a certain kind of epilepsy that's really debilitating young children. And they hadn't, up to this point, had any good solutions. All they could do was have brain surgery and take out a piece of their brain. But for those kids, a few people who have epilepsy, which is a genetic disorder, CBD is really helpful. For the other uses, it could be a placebo. It could be helpful. We don't know. Placebos, by the way, work for about 60 to 70% of us. So, I don't know. I think probably a lot of it is a placebo effect, but we're going to do the studies and we'll find out. In the meantime, CBD isn't at all harmful. It doesn't produce a high. It's not addictive. Make it over the counter. THC, on the other hand, is definitely not medicine. So why do these compounds work? Why are they so popular? Well, they work because they mimic these chemicals, anandamide and 2-arachidonylglycerol, or 2-AG, which are neurotransmitters in our brain. Just like morphine works by mimicking endorphins, THC works by mimicking anandamide and 2-AG. And what are anandamide and 2-AG doing? Lots. All the green here, which is all over the cortex, not really, really densely, but it's very ubiquitous, much more anandamide and 2-AG than dopamine by a mile, for instance. It's also down in the cerebellum that has to do with motor and coordination. But obviously the cortex is thinking, abstract reasoning, emotional behavior. It is all in these internal structures having to do with feelings, learning and memory, anxiety and stress. So basically, anandamide and 2-AG are all over the brain. And the reason marijuana works is because it interferes with those spots. And there was a paper came out about, I was going to say 2 weeks ago, but anyway, 5 weeks ago, in a good journal reviewing and I really recommend this paper. If you can't get it, I'd be glad to send it to somebody. But looking at the developing brain. So it turns out, and here's the abstract, which you can kind of read if you don't like to look at my pictures of brain development. But here is a schematic from the paper. These researchers at Mount Sinai, they're really top researchers in the world. And what they're showing in this side, I see I covered up the scale. This is the places that the binding happens for those, the green spots for those chemicals. And you could see that during gestation, it's real high, and then it kind of lowers down. At birth, it stays low during childhood, and then it explodes during adolescence. This is anandamide, a similar kind of pattern, and this is 2-AG. And what you can see is that during adolescence, there are massive changes in these signaling molecules. So we're not talking about THC now. We're talking about the natural neurotransmitters that are in our brains, and especially in kids' brains during adolescence. And they're only there because they play a really important role, and they play an important role in how the brain matures. So to try to explain that, I'll just point out here, early on, the cells are just duplicating, and then you have this huge forest of cells through early childhood. And the function of adolescence is kind of prune that down. And these cells are pruned down as a result of experience interacting with, our individuals, so who we are. And what we do during adolescence is we try this and that and him and her, and we say, I like this, I don't like that, and I want to do this and I don't want that. So we become individuals, we become ourselves. And so the function of this pruning is to help us individuate, to use an old psychological term, to become, who we are as adults. And when I got to treatment at 23, I was about like a 14-year-old. So I didn't do that. I smoked so much marijuana. I'm sure my brain was not looking normal. And that's probably why I acted like a 13-year-old. But I just, again, want to point out that the massive parts of change are right around birth and all during adolescence. So to try to this is a new area of research, understanding anandamide and 2-AG, but I'm going to explain that using a story about my dog. And I think it works with the science and it makes it easier to explain right now, but I could also give you more scientific papers if you want. So here's my puppy. He's now 100 pounds and almost 5. But at the one day when he was little, this is a true story, he was out walking in the yard and my daughter, who was then 12 or 13, dropped a piece of bacon by mistake, which he grabbed. This is actually DNA because that's my bacon, but his brain lit up. I'm quite sure he was really excited about the bacon. And I'm sure that anandamide and 2-AG were being released in places to do with smell and taste and memory and excitement and pleasure, because this was such a salient and important stimulus to him that those chemicals get released to try to instantiate how important for him this bacon might have been. And I don't know what your version of bacon is. It might be a loved one. It might be great music. It might be a poem or, a trip to Paris. But when important things happen to you, they're important because anandamide and 2-AG are released in the brain areas that help us experience those events. And the reason these chemicals are all over the brain is because all the brain is processing our whole world. And you never know, are you going to like, kissing a boy or kissing a girl? So you kind of have to have both or both, all the areas lit up. So what this means is that endocannabinoids like 2-AG and anandamide modulate almost all the brain activity. And they play a critical role in neuroplasticity or adaptation or learning and memory, however you want to talk about it. And they act like a highlighter to tell the brain, wow, I like that, or that seems important, or hey, that's a key idea. And this helps us sort what's important and not important, which is actually the whole point of adolescence, right? Once we're 30, hopefully we figure that out. Well, it's a little different with THC, isn't it? Because we don't release it in little synapses here and there, according to, the poetry of Wordsworth or Keats. Instead, we smoke it and it fills our whole brain. So everything gets turned on. Everything is meaningful, or everything is bacon. And I personally love the feeling of this. So it was fantastic. Everything was hilarious, delicious. All the music was good. All the ideas were brilliant. I mean, it's just like, turn up the volume on every sensory piece of input. And it was fun to me. It was an antidote to boredom. And again, kids have low tolerance for boredom, and some have a lower tolerance than others. So this doesn't seem so bad, right? The acute effects of marijuana are to cause pleasure and relaxation in some people, also anxiety in others, but they're more protected, to make stimuli more rich and meaningful. I can remember being at a friend's house and we were hungry after getting stoned, and her parents had rice-a-roni in the cupboard. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, how does this stuff stay on the shelves? It's so good. I wouldn't, eat that if I was camping today, but at the time it was so delicious because it was enhanced just this way. But this impairs memory. It does so because if everything is meaningful, then you can't really sort what to store as a memory and what not to. It also slows our response time and makes it hard to track things, again, because everything is flooded. But this doesn't seem so bad to me. It's not like alcohol. Alcohol does, causes more car accidents and, more likely to be involved in sexual assault. So there's a lot of reasons this seems pretty innocuous, except for the B process. Remember, the brain is going to adapt to anything that changes its feelings. And to try to describe that quickly, I'm showing you, these are slices of a rat's brain who had, this one had a saline injection, just a placebo. And this one had THC injections, only 6 exposures to THC. But you can tell, I'm sure, that the brain slices on the right are much lighter. There's less dark spots. Those dark spots are the spots that anandamide and 2-AG act at. So what happens is, because everything seems meaningful, the brain dampens its ability to detect meaning. It's trying to maintain homeostasis. And that there's tons of pictures just like this, in dozens and dozens of papers. So it's a kind of incontrovertible fact that THC causes what we call a downregulation of the endocannabinoid system. And in heavy smoking teens, that's for sure. So here we look at all these green spots are where they don't have anywhere near as much endocannabinoid signaling as they should. And because they're teenagers, the purpose of endocannabinoid signaling is to tell them what's important. So as they're bathing their brains in THC, like I was, they're altering the structure of their cortex. This might not be permanent. They'll be a little insensitive, but the cortex is being organized during adolescence to reflect our development and maturation. And it's being organized differently in teens who smoke regularly. And the consequences of that are pretty big. They have fewer receptors for THC, but also for anandamide and 2-AG in those mesolimbic structures. So what are the receptors doing in those structures? It's telling them what's pleasurable. What do they really like? And that downregulation means that you experience less pleasure. My husband says to me still, can't you just be satisfied with this? And actually, it's harder for me to be satisfied. I have reduced, I'm sure, sensitivity in that mesolimbic pathway. For that reason, I'm prone to take more of other drugs because they don't work as well. So, what one drink or one snort would do for somebody, it wouldn't do as much for me because I have an insensitivity in that pathway. And that's kind of developed in. As a result of all that, I just said this, they're more impulsive. They're more negative when they're not using. So, less content because less pleasure, less likely to graduate high school. They have an increased risk of psychosis and more likely to attempt suicide. So these are serious, nothing like medicine effects. And they're likely to be semi-permanent. So I talked, okay, so let me just say that. Now I only have maybe 10 or 12 more slides, and I think I'm right on schedule, I think, mostly. But I want to just shift a little bit because you're probably working with people who might be using cannabis while they're pregnant. And this is really popular. I could go on and on with stories, but a lot of people think, well, it's natural and, it's probably good for us. Lots of natural things are bad, like arsenic or radon. So it doesn't mean just because it's natural, it's good. And in fact, we weren't sure, but in 2019, the Surgeon General, just, out of an abundance of caution, said, maybe not, which didn't have any effect at all. I heard a story the other day of from someone who works in Colorado, and she said that pregnant women went to the store where you can, there's loads and loads of different kinds of weed, and she said to the 22-year-old chemist in the back, what do you think I should use? I'm pregnant. I'm feeling kind of little morning sickness. And he said, oh, gee, I'm not sure. I think you should probably get the strongest one. So this is really widespread, a big increase. And this is a new data came out a few months ago. And I know it's a really busy slide. It's straight from the paper, but I just wanted to share it with you because they were looking at 3 groups of people. On the left is always people who are unexposed, have never used THC, as far as we know. In the middle are people who were using, found out when they got pregnant, stopped using. And at the end were people who were using, got pregnant, and kept using or started using during pregnancy. And what they're measuring here is in 4 and 5-year-olds, psychotic-like experiences. I guess this is like an irrational fear of things under the bed or something. Internalizing symptoms, depression, anxiety, externalizing symptoms, getting in trouble at school or daycare, attention problems like ADHD, thought problems, cognitive impairments, lower IQs, and social problems. This could also be, oh no, I said that, social, so maybe autism-like behaviors. And you can see clearly in every case, the more exposure, the more problems. And this is, again, lots of signaling happening prenatally and lots of signaling happening and changes in signaling happening in adolescence. And so both of those times are going to be really important. And you may have picked this up in the abstract I showed you, but epigenetics is a field, burgeoning, growing fast field, looking at the effects of all kinds of experiences that we pass down to our offspring. And in a growing number of studies, it's clear that the offspring of adolescent partiers, so that in these studies, they took, for instance, rats when they were adolescents, gave them in one study 8 exposures to THC, then stopped, let them grow up, and then, marry other rats and have babies. And their children are more anxious than if they had been injected with, say, a placebo like saline. They're more likely to take more heroin and more alcohol. They're more likely to be depressed. And their offspring, so these are the grandchildren or grandbaby rats of adolescent partiers. So these changes last multiple lifetimes. And in that Nature Neuroscience paper by Barra et al., you can get a really recent review of all this. And it's alarming to neuroscientists, I think. So another example, so the way that the B process happens, the way the brain compensates for THC is to downregulate anandamide and 2-AG. We're going to look at another example that's also relevant. So narcotics have been around a long time, as all drugs have, really, pretty much. It wasn't such a problem. We isolated morphine. It was named after the god of dreams because it produces this lovely, dreamy state. Again, not too bad until we got syringes, and now we have synthetic analogs like fentanyl and carfentanil. So it's a growing problem. And I'm gonna quickly talk about what is the A process and the B process with opioids. So These drugs, morphine, heroin, fentanyl, Dilaudid, Oxycontin, you've heard of them, there's dozens of them, work because they mimic uh, natural neurotransmitters like endorphin and enkephalin and dynorphin and endomorphin. So we have neurotransmitters that are just, we actually make morphine naturally in our brain in little tiny bits, little tiny amounts. So these chemicals that come from plants or laboratories are just mimicking what we already have. And why do we already have this? I told you we had anandamide and 2-AG to help us sort meaningful things from unmeaningful things. We have these for lots of reasons. They are involved in learning and memory, really involved in attachment and bonding, but they're especially involved in helping us cope with stress. So scientists have spent these chemicals, endorphins and things, were discovered in the 70s and 80s. So since for 50 years, people have been studying, when are they released? What are they doing? And they're released when we exercise or when we're exposed to cold or when we get in an environment that's scary, or we're having sex, especially if you're female, or you're defeated, especially if you're a male. Acupuncture, electric shock, being hungry, force swim, heat exposure, immobilization. These are mostly done in rats, but in this last example, they're done in undergraduates. So you offer students, I didn't do this, I seem so gleeful, but I think it's a clever study. They offer students extra credit for solving anagrams, and it turns out they're unsolvable. They're just not. So students, freak out because anything for the extra point. And so that when they freak out, they're releasing opioids to help them cope with that stress. And so these compounds are constantly all over our brain. The pathways are everywhere, helping us mitigate uncomfortable, stressful situations. I probably release them before my talk, right? And this is adaptive because if we're in stress, if we're in danger, if we have injury, we don't want to be losing it. We want to be, carrying on, and then we'll worry about it later. And opioids help us to do that. But again, the brain always works in a kind of a yin and a yang and a balance. And we also make anti-opioids. And these get much less press. Nobody wants to talk about the party poopers, but these are also adaptive. And when we're safe, they help us feel pain. So one of my favorite stories about this comes from a student. I was describing this to a student in class, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I know exactly this." He was in his final soccer tournament of the year. They were going to win the state championship or something, and they did win, but he's in the last 6 minutes of the game, and he turns out he has an injury and he breaks his tibia. Well, he has no idea he broke it. He still plays. He keeps running around oblivious. They get done, they win, he's cheering it, everything's great, doesn't feel a thing. Gets in the minivan with his parents. I just love it because it's a minivan. And then he's safe. So if you ignore a broken bone for long, you'll get an infection. It'll never heal. It's no good. And your body knows that. So as soon as he gets safe with mom and dad, he goes, reaches down, ouch, oh my gosh, look at my leg. Starts swelling up. They go right to the hospital. He's broken his leg. He just played the game like that. So we have both the ability to block pain and then to block the pain blocking compounds. This is great for most of us. It's the bane of every heroin or opiate addict, because these things increase. They're really potent. They're really effective. They can completely block the effects of heroin. So you can't get high. And all you can do is use so that you don't have miserable pain. The short way to think of that, I guess, is no free lunch. So as a quiz, since I'm a teacher, we adapt to every single drug by producing the opposite effect. Opiates lead to suffering. alcohol leads to the exact opposite of what it does. It's always the opposite, a decrease in your pleasure, anxiety, and a problem sleeping. Nicotine, which helps you concentrate and relax, leads to anxiety and difficulty concentrating. Ecstasy, you don't even have to know what it does, clearly leads to depression. Benzodiazepines like Ambien and Xanax, anxiety and insomnia. So over time, you get the exact opposite effect. Now, the brain is adapting, so recovery can occur as the brain readapts, but it takes time. It's like addiction. It depends on time and gradual change. The brain is not really quick at changing. And the longer a person's been using, the higher doses they've been using, the more frequently they've been using, the deeper the addiction, the longer it's going to take. And multi-generational impacts like those from epigenetics are going to probably take even more time because it's kind of built into the way the brain is. So my last slide, the brain adapts to every drug that alters its activity by producing the opposite state. Those changes are responsible for tolerance, dependence, and craving, and that's what addiction is.